Hey everyone, and welcome to this month's live event for National Sewing Circle. Once again, we have Nicki LaFoille back to answer all of your sewing questions. Thanks so much for being here, Nicki.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, so if you follow us on Facebook at all, you know that we asked for suggestions for some mystery project supplies, and we're going to be revealing those in just a little bit, but we're still going to be answering your sewing questions as well. So our first question is one that came in from Sue. And she says, do you know of a technique or product for painting fabric that will dry soft? I want to paint a decoration on a wool area rug.
I have not done much painting on fabric. The few times that I've done anything on fabric, I've used fabric markers. But as far as fabric paints, I know in Joann Fabrics or in your craft stores, in the craft section, in Hobby Lobby or even Walmart might have some fabric paints. You can read the labels on the little paint squeezy bottles and see what they are suitable for. And a lot of them will say fabric paint, and it'll give you instructions on the back on how to use it and how, if you need to heat it to heat set it or anything like that. And washing instructions for afterward. Usually they'll have all that on the bottle. So you can go and peruse and see what would be best for your project.
Absolutely. And we were talking a little bit about this before, right before we went live, as to what kind of paint to use. And I just thought of something. I was thinking soft as in soft to the feel, but do you know of something that would make it so it doesn't maybe crack? Like if the rug gets bent or something like that, if there's a way to do that kind of painting.
Yeah, I think paints made for fabric will do that. Like paints made for t-shirts, they have all those projects in Joann Fabrics where they've got a bunch of t-shirts and they've got the stencils and the paints right there. I feel like those kinds of paints that are made for knit fabrics won't crack because they'll be made to move with the fabric. And we were also talking about puff paints too, which is maybe not exactly right for this project, but those are soft to the touch. When you squeeze them out, they have the little nozzle. So instead of painting with a paintbrush, you just squeeze it out of the bottle and draw whatever design you're drawing, and it kind of puffs up and it's soft and squishy. So that's kind of a fun thing to do too.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you called them puff paints, because I think that's what they're called. I think we always called them squish paints because you got to actually squish them out of the bottle. I don't know. That's just what we called them. But all right. Our next question here, this is from Carol. And she says, I hear it's not recommended to pre-wash fat quarters. I'm old fashioned and cut all of my fabric before and wash all of my fabric before cutting out and sewing. What do you recommend?
I have never heard the advice to not wash fat quarters. I've just always heard to just wash your fabric before you use it, no matter what it's cut in or what type it is. So I always recommend washing your fabrics for sure. That'll get rid of any, sometimes when the fabrics come from the manufacturer, they have excess dye or excess chemicals. Sometimes they treat fabrics with chemicals for shipping and sitting on the shelf. So washing will get rid of all of that so that your fabric is nice and soft and you know what hand you're getting when you're sewing the fabric. And also if there's any shrinkage that's going to happen, that'll take care of that before you cut out any of your pieces or anything. And always wash your fabric the way that you would wash the finished garment. So I always wash everything on cold. That's just how I wash my clothes. So that's how I wash all my fabric too.
Perfect. We're going to talk a little bit more about fat quarters in a minute, just because that is one of our mystery supplies that we had to use. But so the only thing that I would say, as in not washing a fat quarter, so if you have more of a quilting background or do a lot of quilting, they recommend that you don't wash pre-cut fabrics. And generally that means, a 10-inch square, a 5-inch square, smaller squares like that, just because it's kind of hard to wash all those little pieces. So maybe if you've heard don't wash pre-cuts and you associate fat quarters with pre-cuts, maybe that's where you're getting that recommendation from. But yeah, I agree with Nicki that you should wash most of your fabric ahead of time. I have to admit, I don't do it when I'm quilting, but I do when I'm doing like garment sewing or things like that. But speaking of fat quarters, that was one of our supplies that we had to use. So we got some suggestions of 3 to 4 sewing supplies to use to make a mystery project. And both of us made a project. If you're not familiar with what fat quarters are, I just have a couple to show you. They're fun little either squares or rolls of fabric that are 18 by 21 inches. So this month we had 2 fat quarters, bias binding, and Velcro. That was our supplies. So what did you make?
I made this fun little thing that I am modeling right now. It's a scarf, sort of like a circle scarf or an infinity scarf that have been really popular for the last couple years, but I made it different. So here's my Velcro, but it comes apart. So it's not just a plain Jane circle scarf. You can wear it flat. And of course I've got my one fabric for my 1 fat quarter on one side and the other on the other side. And it's just bound just to give it a little extra something. And I didn't do the Velcro all the way down because I didn't want it to be stiff. And it has the added benefit of, I didn't even plan this, but it has the added benefit of giving it this cool little like kerchief look because you get the point down. So you can wear it on either side. You can twist it and then Velcro it. You can do whatever you want with it. And then, like I said, you can wear it as a flat scarf. You can wear it open like that. You can close it up and wear it. And it's soft, so it's just these 2 layers of cotton fabric. So I'm thinking like if you're a mom, use it as a burp cloth, you know, like double.
An unintentional one maybe even.
Yeah.
I don't.
But it'll wash up really nice because it's just cotton fabric. So we can talk about how I made this, or you can show your project.
We're going to talk about my project in a second because we were talking about that beforehand too. But I think it is really cool, like you said, with the design of it, because I assumed you cut an angle at the end, but you did not. So I guess, yeah, what size, if someone wants to make like the exact, what you just made, what size did you cut your fabric, and yeah, how did you put it all together?
So I used all of my fat quarters. So my fat quarter, like you said, a fat quarter is an 18 by 21 or 22 inch square, not square, rectangle. But they call it a fat quarter because it is a half yard of fabric that is cut widthwise. So that's how you get, it's a quarter yard of fabric, but it's not 9 inches by 36 inches. It's cut the other way. So you get a little bit more usable size out of it. So I wrote down kind of what I did. So I cut my fat quarters in half so that they would be long, a long skinny rectangle. And then I just stitched those together along the short end. And that's how I got my long skinny rectangles. And so I cut them so that they ended up being 9 inches by
42, 41?
Yeah, when you put it together.
40. You essentially took a fat quarter and turned it back into a quarter yard of fabric. We reversed it.
Essentially I did, yes. I didn't think of it that way. But yes, I had these fat quarters, so it just took another extra seam to get it into the long skinny length, but I had these lying around. And this fabric, actually, I wanted to mention before I forget, these are from Wyndham Fabrics. So WINDHAM fabrics.net. They have a ton of really cute cotton prints. So that's where I got those from. So the construction of this was super easy. 2 seams to get the bigger rectangles together. And then I just put those together with wrong sides together, matching all the raw edges. And the bias binding, I made this bias binding myself, so that was what took the longest. And it wasn't hard, it's just kind of time consuming to make that, and in what would otherwise be a super quick and easy project. Like, you could do this without binding the edges, just put these rectangles together with right sides together, stitch around the perimeter, but leave an opening for turning it right side out. and then finish that opening. But the binding, I just like, you know, it's got that, it's purple, so it's gives it a little pop, gives it a little something extra. And then the Velcro, so I just did a 2-inch strip of Velcro. This is, how wide is this? This is 5/8 inch wide Velcro. And it's sew on Velcro, so I just stitched along the perimeter of the Velcro on that side and then on that side so that they would match up like that. So it was a really easy project. And the bias binding, so we can talk about, I have a lot to say about bias binding.
Well, okay, I want to say, go ahead and tell how you made it, but if someone is sitting there thinking, okay, I want to make a quick and easy scarf project just like this, and I don't want to take the time to make my own bias binding, you can absolutely find it in the store, double fold or single fold bias binding. It'll differ by the width of the binding, and it does come in a bunch of different colors too. You generally, I don't think I've ever found pre-made bias binding in prints, but you can find them in a bunch of different colors. So you would still be able to find like a purple or something to accent your fabric. But yes, how do you make bias binding? And also, because it was the requirement of this month's project is why you did bias as opposed to straight grain, correct?
Correct. Since these are all straight edges, it didn't necessarily have to be bias binding. You want to definitely use bias binding whenever you are binding an edge that is a curve, because the bias of the fabric of the binding will allow it to curve around curves and it'll still lie flat and nice. So I could have done the binding on the straight grain. And that would have just been, you know, cutting long strips, which would be pretty easy to do. You might have to join a couple of ends, but that'd be pretty easy. So you could do that with this project as well. But doing it on the bias, it also is a good opportunity for me to talk about how to make bias binding, because it is a handy thing to know how to do. So making bias binding, I have a video on making bias binding on nationalsewingcircle.com. So you can go there, check that out. But I don't think I talk about the formula in my video. So there's a formula. We're going to start from the very beginning here. The formula to figure out how much bias binding you need to make. I like making my bias binding because, as I mentioned, you can do it in whatever fabric you choose. You can match. And once you know how to do it, it's like you don't even have to think about it. It can go, you know, pretty quick and easy. So the formula for making the bias binding, you want to add up the total length of the edges that you need to bind. So this was 43 by 9 or something. So that was 104 inches. And then you want to take about 5% of that, which was about 5 inches, excuse me, just for seam allowances and a little bit extra, and add that. And then I always add a little bit more, so I added another 5 inches. So all told, the extra with the seam allowances and the waist and the extra, I added 10 inches extra. And that seems to be a good number for me, because I have bound pot holders before and just little projects, like I don't do quilts. But for the littler projects, 10 inches extra seems to be plenty. So I think no matter what size project you're doing, just adding like 10 inches extra is good for giving yourself a buffer. Because there's nothing worse than making your bias binding and being like an inch short. That's just heartbreaking.
You can just patch that in. I'm sure it'll look fine. It's good.
Make it work, but it's sad. So, and I did double fold bias binding, and it wound up, I wanted the finished bias binding to be 1/2 inch wide. So I cut 2-inch wide strips, because 1/2 inch for each seam allowance and then 1/2 inch on each side adds up to 2 inches. So for the formula, I had 104 inches plus 10 inches extra, so that's 114 inches. Multiply that number by the width of your binding, the cut width of your binding. So I multiplied that by 2. So that got me to 228. And then take the square root of that. So get your calculator or do a Google search on what is the square root of 228, which is what I did. And
don't lie, you did mental math. You did it in your head.
Yeah, right. It only took me 2 hours to figure that out. So the square root of 228 is 15.09. So you always want to round up. So round up to the ½ inch. You never want to round down, even if it's 15.01. Do not round that off because you need that 0.01. So round up. And that's another way to get yourself a little bit of extra binding for buffer. So I cut a 15.5 inch square. And you take your square and you cut it on the diagonal. And this is, I have the video shows all of this, the video that I made. And also on soeasy.com, so-sew-easy.com. They have a tutorial with a lot of good pictures. So you take your square, cut it along the diagonal, and you move the upper part down. So what I did was, on my square, I marked the top and the bottom edge with a pin, just to denote which edge was which. So cut on the diagonal, and then move the top slice down so that you were lining up what was the top and bottom of your square. So line that up, sew it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You want your pieces to be offset a little bit so that your 1/4 inch seam allowance is going to match on the edge. So you've got little kind of triangular corners poking out on each side. Press open that seam, and then along the long edge, which is going to be on the bias now, the long edge of your parallelogram shape, draw your 2-inch lines for your 2-inch bias strips. And then the next step is kind of weird. If you Google it and look at pictures, it'll be easier to understand, or go watch the video to see me actually doing it. But you want to fold that parallelogram right sides together, and you're matching the short edges, but you're not matching them end to end. You have to offset it by 1 so that you're not just creating loops, you're creating a continuous strip. So the technique is called the continuous bias binding technique. So you offset it a little bit, offset it by 1 line, and sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure that your lines that you drew are matching at that 1/4 inch seam allowance along the top. Press that open, and then you just start cutting along the first line that you drew, and keep cutting. It's like this tube you've got, and it just keeps like unraveling and unraveling, and you get a nice long strip of bias binding. And all the seams are already pressed open and everything, and it's ready to go on. And then you get to fold it and press it, and that's where one of these comes in handy. So this is a bias binding making tool. So it's really simple. You take the end of your bias binding and you put it through the wide end. Use a pin. They've got a slot on the top. You can use a pin to slide it through to the short end. And as it comes through, it's like this U shape. So as it goes through, it's going to fold your long edges in. So this would be for double fold bias binding. It'll fold the long edges in to meet in the middle. So I take this and I've got it going along my ironing board, and as I pull the bias binding out of it, taking my iron and pressing that so that I'm not like trying to fold the little edges into the middle and burning my fingers and everything, which I still do sometimes, I'll be honest, but it's a lot easier with a tool like this. And a note about these tools, so this is a 25mm size bias binding maker, which shakes out to 1 inch. However, it says it's a 1 inch, but you need to cut your strips at 2 inches to fit in there so that when it comes out, it's 1 inch. But then as you put it onto your project, you're folding it over again, so you're folding it again so that it ends up as a 1/2 inch. So the numbers are it can be a little confusing.
Yeah.
But if you want your binding to end up, your double fold binding to end up at 1/2 inch, use a 1 inch bias binding tool, but cut your strips at 2 inches.
Perfect. And just so nobody has to feel like they need to take notes on this right now, when you buy those binding makers at the store, they actually have on the back of the little cardboard package, it'll tell you cut strips this wide for this size of tool. And those tools do come in different finished width sizes. So it maybe even if a project, down the road, you want a thinner binding, you can get a tool that will make that as well.
Yes, they come in all different widths.
Perfect. We're going to come to Velcros in a little bit, but we have a couple questions that came in that I want to ask. And the first one here, this is from Lori, and she wants to know, how does one sew with no space to work?
Hilarious, Lori, because that is the story of my life. I do not have a sewing room. I sew in our guest bedroom upstairs, which my husband also uses for his work. So all of my sewing stuff, every time I go to sew something, I have to take everything out of the closet, take my sewing machine out and set it up, take all my baskets out and set it up, and then when I'm done, I have to break everything down and put it back. So it's a little frustrating, but I have, as for a desk, I have this little folding table. Actually, we bought it at Walmart. We use it as a camping table sometimes. It's just this fold-up plastic table. So I move my husband's computer stuff to the side and put my sewing machine up there. But to cut down on space usage, instead of an ironing board, I just have the flat June Taylor, I think, pressing mat, which is really nice. It's this big rectangle, and I just slide it behind the bed when I'm done with it. I don't have to, fold down this big bulky ironing board. So that is a great tool that I love. And I keep all of my stuff in totes. So I have one sewing basket that I keep all of my important things in that I always know that I always need to have. And then I have another organizing tote that I keep all my other notions in. So it's this long rectangular thing with handles, and it's got an upper tray that comes out and then the lower tray in the bottom. So it's kind of cool to have compartments for storing things. Then I store all of my patterns and my fabric in just a Rubbermaid tote, which is not ideal, but it works. And I fold my fabric and I set it on its side so that it's not in a stack, so that I don't have to rummage through the stack when I want to find something. I do it on its side so that I can see everything, almost like a filing cabinet. So yeah, it is definitely a challenge to sew with no space. And as for a cutting mat, I have just this it's not flimsy, obviously, because I've been using it since college, but it's not one of the heavy duty self-healing mats. It's just a really thin mat. I slide under the bed when I'm not using it, and I just slide it back out when I need it. So I cut on the floor.
I sympathize with you, because this is what I did a lot of sewing when I was in college, and so I had the same thing in my dorm room, and I had my little sewing machine. And then where we used to live, I used to have to just sew at the kitchen table. That was pretty much my go-to, and it was kind of awkward sometimes because I had a high table, so I felt like I was always like this trying to get my fabric in. But where we live now, I actually have 2 sewing rooms. One's the sewing storage, and then both rooms have a walk-in closet, so I have so much space. So if we ever leave, we're going to have to purchase a house that has extra bedrooms specifically, because once you have this much space, you can't go back. There's no way.
Yeah, no, you need you need the master bedroom, the guest bedroom, the nursery.
A couple sewing rooms.
Room.
Yep. Couple, yeah.
Perfect. For sure. Wow.
But I do want to point out, we do have an article on National Sewing Circle that talks about setting up sewing rooms. And one of the sewing rooms that's featured in that article is actually a lady who turned her closet into a sewing room. So it's actually really cool. It was a larger size closet, but when you open the closet door, she has room for a little desk in there. I think there's even like a fold down iron off the wall and things like that. So a fun article that sort of helps you learn how to maximize what space you do have to make sure you get all the essentials into your sewing area.
Yeah, that is great. Yeah, you definitely, necessity is the mother of invention. So when you are crammed in a little space, you find ways to maximize your efficiency for space, for sure. So it is a challenge, but
doable.
Yes, for sure.
All right, we have a next question here. This is from Christine. It's kind of a long one, but she would like to recreate a dress for her daughter. The outer shell of the dress is silk chiffon and the lining is 100% polyester. At the bottom of the silk outer shell are 2 rows of eyelet stitching. Each row is continuous. She says her sewing machine has an eyelet stitch, but it doesn't look like it will be continuous or be a continuous stitch. So she's looking for some help in how to create that continuous eyelet stitch along the bottom.
Okay. So an eyelet stitch is, so eyelets, when I think eyelets, I think of just the little holes in the fabric, either with a little grommet or like edged in zigzag stitching.
Yes.
So to do an eyelet stitch, I guess, is that like a built-in, like a circular?
So I thought it was called more of like a hem stitching kind of detail, where it actually does stitching so, I guess, tight that it pulls the weave of the fabric apart and does that kind of satin stitch, and you have a little tiny hole in the middle. So that's the only way that I know how to do it on a machine, and that is a designated stitch. And you might have to have a designated machine to do that. So I don't know if a standard sewing machine has what would make an eyelet stitch.
Right.
Unless you know of one, I'm not sure that that's possible.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know of like the built-in eyelet stitch. But yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too, those heirloom stitches. You use a wing needle, I think. The wing needle has little flanges on the side of the blade to push the fabric away, so you create like a little hole in the fabric. But yeah, I'm not familiar with that kind of heirloom stitching, unfortunately, so I don't know that I can really answer that one.
Yeah, I think I've never made anything that fancy before.
Yeah.
So your daughter is very lucky for you to be going to so much effort to recreate this dress, and I'm sure it's going to look amazing when it's done.
It sounds like it will be beautiful, and good luck.
All right, our next question here. Babe says, what do you like to do with scrap fabric?
Scrap fabrics, well, they're always good for test stitches. So I always have some on hand if I ever need to test a stitch, test my tension, test my buttonholes or whatever. They're good for starter squares too, if you need to like start your line of stitching, especially if you're using a nice like thin slinky fabric. A lot of times that can get jammed down into the throat plate at the beginning of the seam. So using a starter square or starter scrap can get that going, and then you just continue right on onto your project fabric. If you have big enough scraps, you can, and if you are dedicated enough, you can patchwork them into a bigger piece and use them for any number of cool things like pillowcases, table runners, quilts if you have that many, and if you're that dedicated. But yeah, little patchwork things like pot holders even. So you can patch those together to do something cool like that. But yeah, I always just use them as testers, and I have way more pieces of scrap fabric than I will ever need to test anything on. But you know, when it's a little chunk like that, like I can't bear to throw it away.
So that was going to be my very important follow-up question is how big or small does the scrap have to be to make the keep cut versus the throwaway cut?
So I don't have like a hard line, like a hard measurement or anything, but you know, like this big, and especially if it is rectangular or square, you know, if it is this long, skinny strip, that probably won't make the cut, or if it's in like a weird shape, it won't make the cut, but like a chunk with good edges.
I'm getting excited talking about it. I didn't know you were partial to squares and rectangles, but
pleasing to the eye.
So just to point out a couple of things that you were talking about, patchwork, things like that. We have a bunch of videos on the site. Actually, Tara Rex, one of our instructors, she does a lot of really fun and funky things with little tiny bits of fabric. So she has one that's patchwork, and I believe it's one of those like rice pack things that you can like hot and cold kind of packs. She also makes a really fun fabric belt where she just uses lots of little tiny scraps and does some free motion stitching and has all those in place. So definitely a lot of options there. And then on our sort of sister site is National Quilters Circle, and there's a fun article where one of the instructors there actually uses even the smallest teeny tiny little scraps and keeps them all in a little bin. And then she'll make little dog beds and stuff them with the scrap fabric, and then she donates them to shelters. And so if you can find a place like that to where you're actually putting your scraps to good use, that's an awesome idea too. So
yeah.
Even the little teeny tiny non-rectangular pieces can get put to some use.
Yeah, good for stuffing. I didn't think of that. And little pieces are good for applique too. If you're doing applique, you can use even some small pieces for that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, just want to remind everyone we're about halfway through, but if you have any sewing questions, go ahead and type those into the comment box below the video and we will continue answering them. But I want to get back to our mystery project because Velcro is the only thing we didn't talk about. So what kind did you use? Sew in, sticky back? How do you pick the type you're going to use?
So I just used the sew on variety. So Velcro does come in an adhesive backed variety, which you have to sew on anyway. So I guess the adhesive is just like, so you don't
have to pin it.
Yeah, because pinning Velcro is kind of impossible because it's tough to get a pin through and then it's all like, you know, scrunched up. But I just don't like sewing through adhesive things. I haven't done that much, but it just makes me kind of nervous. And I know that if you sew through adhesive things and if your needle gets gummed up, you can use a Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol and just clean it off. And it's not a big deal. But I just always opt for the sew on Velcro anyway. And this was easy. I didn't need to even pin it on. I just held it on. You can use clips like binder clips if you want to hold that on. You can use Scotch tape if you need to. So that is the variety that I like.
Perfect. I have to say I have used the sticky back or adhesive variety, and I made the mistake of choosing the industrial strength stick because I assumed that would mean I didn't have to sew it, but it's the same thing. I mean, the very first time you use it, it stays stuck to your fabric just fine, but then it does kind of start to pull away a little bit. And yes, you can clean your needle while you're going, but the biggest problem I had is that it would get so gummed up so quickly, especially with that adhesive or extra strength adhesive, that about every third or fourth stitch you'd get a skipped stitch. And so it was happening so often that it was like, this is impossible to stop this many times. So if you know you're going to stitch through it, yeah, definitely just forego the sticky part of it at all.
Yeah, and one other note on Velcro, as you are stitching through, so it's got the hooks on the one side, that's the scratchy kind, the scratchy part, and then the loops on the other side, which is the soft side. And that the softer side is never an issue for me. Sometimes though, on the hook side, my thread will try to get caught in those little hooks. So on the long edges of Velcro, there's a little almost like a selvage kind of, where there aren't any hooks. So try to sew on that, but then when you're sewing across the short end, you're going to be sewing across the hooks. So I have found that if you're using 100% cotton thread, it is more likely that you're going to get loops in your stitching because cotton thread, it's a little bit loftier. It has more flyaways sometimes. So that can get caught in those and you won't get a nice flat stitch. Just make sure your tension settings are correct when you're starting out. Make sure everything is lying flat, and that will help. But an all-purpose thread will also be a big help in that as well.
Perfect. One more question about Velcro. Does it come in different colors? Could you have found purple Velcro?
I have only seen white and black. I have not seen any colors.
All right, there's a market for it. You and me, we're going to invent colored Velcro here.
That's a really good idea, Ashley.
Oh, great. I shouldn't have said it out loud. No. All right, we're going to move on to a couple more questions in a minute, but I'm going to talk about my project a little bit because it was one of those things where I thought it was going to be a good idea and work, and it didn't. So the main part of the project was I was going to make a pillow. So I took and it's a circular pillow because I had just a round pillow form. And so I just took my 2 fat quarters and just cut a circle. And then I did an envelope style or a overlapped back. And then it's closed with some Velcro. But so for the front, I wanted to try and use the bias binding in a creative way. So I thought since it can bend, I should try and make it into a fun flower on the front. And it didn't really work. But if you ever want to maybe wrap a gift in fabric and then put like a bow on it, I don't know. So mine is one of those projects where you think it's going to be a good idea and then it doesn't work, which is a bummer. But I wanted to share it because I wanted everyone to know that even if a project doesn't work, you learn something. And now I know that maybe bias binding flowers aren't a thing.
Everything is a learning experience. That's good. It's cute, and it does look like a bow for sure. That would be very cute on a fabric wrapped package.
All right. Well, I'll do that at Christmas and then post some pictures of it.
Yeah, good.
All right, our next question here. Lori is currently making a reversible skirt and wonder if you have any advice on handling the elastic waistband. This is right up your alley.
Yes. Yes. So to make it reversible, I think a fold over elastic waistband would be awesome because that you are getting the same look on both sides. And also fold over elastic is ridiculously easy to sew. It's super easy. I love it. And they make fold over elastic in, I don't know if they do it in different colors per se, but I've seen like glitter fold over elastic.
They have so many colors and fun prints. The other day I even saw some leopard print ones. So ooh, whoever makes those needs to make the Velcro too.
Okay, right. Yeah, so you have a bunch of fun options and it's so easy to use. Literally, you just fold it over the edge. And of course, as you're sewing elastic to, if you're doing it to like a cotton that doesn't stretch, you want to stretch the elastic to kind of gather up the fabric in the elastic. But if you're sewing it onto like a knit, you might not necessarily have to do that depending on, the design of your project. But that would be my advice. Fold over elastic. Super cool.
Perfect. And I know we have some videos on the site where Nicki demonstrates several different types of elastics that can go into the waistbands of skirts. And she has a little girl who gets lots of little skirts made for her. So she has plenty of experience with that.
Yes.
All right. Our next question here, how do you store your patterns?
My patterns get stored in the tote, as I was mentioning earlier, the tote with my fabric. So after I use, so if it's a commercial pattern, I fold it up as best as I can and get it back in the envelope. So I keep everything together. And then they just kind of I stack those on the side, on their side too, so I can just like finger through them like a file cabinet. But for patterns that I make myself, those are a little harder because I do them on butcher paper. And so they're a little thicker. It's not that tissue paper that you can fold up however you want, and it, you know, folds down really nice. So for the butcher paper patterns, I typically lay all my pieces together and roll them up in a tube and just throw a rubber band around them. And then they, if they're short enough, they'll stand up in the tote, but if not, they get laid down and they often get squished. So it's not a perfect system. I often will give the tip, which I should use myself. I haven't yet, but I have heard people taking like a Ziploc bag, like a big gallon size one, and you just poke a hole in it under the zip and thread it through a hanger. So that way you can keep everything in the Ziploc bag, hang it up so that it doesn't get squished and you know where it is. So I like that idea. I just don't have a hanger in my sewing room. Like I don't have a bar in a closet. So that would be a great idea for someone who has a closet to work with. I don't yet. So I'm still figuring out the best way to store my patterns. That's how I do it right now, but I'll figure out something better.
I was just thinking with the rolling them up, you should get those poster tubes. Ooh. And like put them in those because they're hard cardboard, and so then they wouldn't get squished as easily.
That's a good idea.
Perfect. All right. Another question here from the same person. Do you have any favorite sites for charity sewing?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually. I haven't done much charity sewing, so I'm not familiar with some different charities. Ashley, do you know of any?
I can't think of the name. I'm going to have to post it in the comments because we did an article on it a couple of years ago, and it was making dresses and for little girls, and you send them. But I do not remember the name of that, so I will find that out and put that in the comments because that was a really good one. And I know even just scrolling through my Facebook feed, there's all sorts of either you can sew, you know, receiving blankets for hospitals or for nurseries or things like that. So there's definitely tons of options out there that you could find a good one, I'm sure.
There are, and I just thought of one. I don't know the name of it, but I know my friend's dad actually was doing this charity, which is amazing. He's so cool. So you sew pads, reusable pads for girls in underdeveloped countries who don't have access to feminine hygiene products, have to stay home from school when they're on their periods, and it sets them back. So sewing reusable pads for them, sustainable, green, help a girl go to school. I thought that charity was really cool. And I don't actually know if it is an organized charity or if it was just he heard of that and he was sewing it. I'm sure there's an organized charity for that.
And I think there are lots of opportunities like that where things that we definitely take for granted, you know, other people don't have. So yeah, definitely there's so many good charities out there. All right, we're gonna have another question here. Krista has been trying to cut 6-inch squares out of t-shirts and old sweaters, but she finds that her cutting ruler moves a lot. So she has to push down really hard on it to keep it in place. Doing this makes her wrists sore and tired. Is there an easier way to keep her cutting square to stay in place while I use a rotary cutter?
I think there might be products that have like a more sticky kind of backing to them so that they don't slip around. Ashley, you're nodding, so you may know like the brand. I don't know the brand.
I do a lot of quilting too, and so there's different rulers that you use for quilting as opposed to sewing. And so you can find your square or your rectangular rulers that have a non-slip surface on the back. And so the ones that I use are from the Omni Grid family, but they're Omni Grip. And so all of the grid lines and markings are that non-slip surface. So you barely have to apply any pressure, like one finger holds it in the middle and it doesn't slip. Another thing, just because a 6-inch square isn't overly large in terms of trying to place it down. We do have a video on National Quilter Circle for how to use the correct hand positioning when holding a ruler. And so there's sort of a fun tip where if this is your ruler, you hold it so that your pinky finger is off of the edge, and that actually kind of helps you hold it down so it doesn't slip. So just that little adjustment, moving your little pinky finger out to the edge, can help it from slipping. But so yeah, there's a whole video on how to use rulers on the site. It's pretty cool.
Cool.
Yeah. All right, we have another question from Babe, who says, thank you for your ideas on pattern storage. She wants to know how often you sew. She also thanks you for answering your questions, and she says, I have tons of questions. If it's too many, I'm not offended if you don't ask them. No, we love all your questions. Send them all in, always.
Yes, keep sending them in, and thank you, Babe, for watching. Thank you very much. So how often do I get to sew? Not as often as I would like to. I have a 4-year-old daughter who takes up a lot of time, but you know, it's fun time. But so I get to sew, you know, a couple hours a week, just little projects for myself and for her. I'm trying to sew curtains for her room right now. I want to sew Hogwarts themed curtains because she's very into Harry Potter. So that'll be my next big project. So I just, you know, I get little snatches of time here and there. She's going to bed later now because it's the summer. So she goes to bed, and then I get like an hour of time that I can choose what I want to do with. Do I want to prep food for tomorrow? Do I want to read? Do I want to sew? So, you know, a couple times a week, maybe I'll be able to get my sewing machine out for an hour or so. So yeah, not as much as I would like, but a little bit here and there.
Perfect. And I know what you mean about a child taking up some of your time. Mine's a little younger. He's only 1, so he hangs out with me in the sewing room. We actually have a ball pit down there. It's over in the corner. This is another advantage of having a large sewing room, is that you can have a playground in the corner. So yeah, that's how I keep him occupied, so I can get some sewing done also.
I share my sewing room with my husband, and you have a ball pit.
I do. I have a ball pit. It's a pretty good size. I'll post a picture of it. It's pretty cute. All right, our next question here. Since sew-on Velcro is kind of abrasive, does it require a heavy-duty or special needle, and does that ruin it for future sewing?
I would say it doesn't require a special needle. I think an all-purpose needle would be fine, but I do think that it will dull your needle quicker. But you are typically not sewing on Velcro for very long. So if you had like an extended piece of Velcro that you were sewing on, like a long strip, you might have to keep that in the back of your mind, like, okay, I sewed 20 inches of Velcro on this. I need to keep an eye out for it being dull on my other fabrics. But I don't think, I don't think you would sew on, this 2-inch strip of Velcro and then be like, okay, I have to throw this needle away. So I don't think it'll do that much damage to it. But I think if you were sewing a bigger strip of Velcro, just keep that in mind and keep an eye out for the signs of a dull needle.
How long of Velcro can you find? Because I know a lot of times people think of the only options of Velcro are those little quarter-sized dots that you can stick in place, or 2-inch lengths. So is there another way you can get Velcro?
My package was this, so it was 12 inches, a 12-inch strip. I am sure you can get Velcro in longer lengths. If not in a package, then from maybe a wholesale site. I'm sure you can get longer strips than that. You might have to go online and do some digging. But yeah, in just the packages, 12 inches, a couple feet probably in the notions section.
Perfect. I think I might have even seen like rolls you can buy it by the yard too, similar to usually over in home decor or drapery, or where you can buy other things like that by the yard. I believe you can do that as well.
Yeah, that would make sense where they have like the trims on the spools or whatever.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So previously you said just watch for the signs of a dull needle. What are those? Because I treat my sewing machine like my car. I expect it to give me warnings, right? So tell me like oil change, whatever. So because I am not one who changes my needle after every 8 hours of sewing or anything like that. I definitely wait until it physically can't sew anymore. So what are some of those signs to look for?
Yeah, eke the very last stitch out of every needle. It'd be nice if your sewing machine had a little change needle light, like the check oil.
That would be amazing. We have so many good ideas. We have additional machine features and colored Velcro. I'm writing them down.
We're just brainstorming here. So the signs of a dull needle, if you don't want to keep track of how many hours you're sewing on a needle, which can be tedious, if you start having tension issues, that is, as you know, kind of like a flashing sign. That's one of the major warning signs of a dull needle. Whenever I have tension issues, that's the first thing I do. After I rethread my needle to make sure everything's threaded correctly. If I'm still having tension issues, I'll change my needle. And a lot of times that will take care of the problem. So if you have, especially if you have thread nests starting on the underside of your fabric, that is typically a sign of an issue with the needle or the needle thread. So change your needle. If you get flagging, so flagging is when the fabric on your machine bed kind of jumps up and down with each pass of the needle through the fabric. That is a sign of a dull needle. And it'll make a little kind of thunk thunk sound, a lot of times in conjunction with the flagging. So you hear thud, thud, thud. That's a dull needle as well. So those are the major points to look for, and then change that needle.
Perfect. And is there ever a time where you save a dull needle for something? I have something in mind. That's why I'm asking if you do.
I don't save dull needles. I do when I have to change my needle between, like I have to change from an all-purpose to a ballpoint needle. If I'm changing projects to sewing a knit, I'll save that all-purpose needle if I've only sewn like one small thing on it. I'll typically just put it through a piece of paper, like a scrap like that, and scrawl a note on it. Microtext 7010, 1 to 2 hours. So I know I've got 5 or 6 more hours left on that needle. So, but I don't save dull needles, so I'm interested to hear what you save dull needles for.
Well, I save everything, but no, I save them specifically for, we even had a fun project we did as part of a challenge a little while ago where we made fabric cards. And so anytime you're going to be doing any kind of sewing, either on paper or through paper or anything like that, where paper does dull your needle faster. So if you have an already dull needle, especially if you're sewing only paper, that's what I use it for. So if you want to sew paper, we have a video on how to make fun fabric cards, or paper cards, excuse me.
Cool, yeah, and it's not like you need a sharp needle to sew through paper.
Perfect.
Cool. Yeah.
All right, we have another question from Babe. She is having trouble using a twin needle. I thought I was following the instructions correctly, but it keeps messing up. Any tips?
So for a twin needle, if you follow the instructions in your machine manual and you're still having problems, my main tip is just to make sure your threads are not getting twisted during the threading process. You want to keep them, let's see if I can point a little bit. So you'll want to keep them separate. So you'll have another thread stand here for your second spool. So you thread one and go on one side of the needle, and then thread the other through, the same threading path, but it diverges down here, and you go to the other side of the needle and thread the other needle. So just try to make sure that the threads aren't getting twisted somewhere. And yeah, it might not be a problem with the needle. it might be, I don't know, something else. So make sure all the rest of your machine is working smoothly. Everything's clean and dusted. And yeah, just try and keep those threads from twisting. And you can even do a little Google search and see if anyone has any specific tips for your specific machine.
I would say that is one thing that different machines sort of have different setups. So I have a very basic Brother machine that doesn't require any setting changes when using a twin needle, but then I have another more fancy computerized machine that actually has a twin needle setting. It's one of those where it's got the fancy screen and I just hit the button, so I don't actually know what it's changing, but it does have that twin needle setting. So if you have a machine like that, maybe check that you don't need to make some sort of change like that to your machine.
Right.
Yep. All right, Christine says, what would be the best hem stitch to use for silk chiffon? Not a rolled hem, but a flat hem.
So how to flat hem silk chiffon? You could try, let's see, you could do a blind hem stitch, perhaps. That gives you a nice flat hem, and that is basically invisible from the right side, which is why it's called a blind hem stitch. So a lot of times your machine will have the built-in hem stitch, which looks just like a straight stitch, but then every couple stitches it's got a little zigzag stitch to bite in. And there's actually have a video on how to blind hem stitch on nationalsewingcircle.com. So you fold your hem up and then you fold it under so that you're sewing on the hem allowance, and the little bite just goes into the face side of the hem, so it just takes a little tiny bite out of it. I did a blind hem stitch on like this damask kind of weave skirt, and it worked really well. It was invisible and it was, you know, nice and flat and smooth. So that would be a good one.
Perfect. And I think just to point out, with a rolled hem, I think it is still kind of flat, right? I mean, I know it's called a rolled hem, but it's the rolled hem foot is rolling the fabric and folding it, but it is still a flat hem. So, I mean, I don't know if you're not familiar with a rolled hem, it doesn't look like a tube or anything. Like, it does actually flatten out when you stitch it. So, and that's just a way to get a really narrow, fine hem. So using that rolled hem foot to do the hem is still an option.
That's true. Yeah, they call it rolled because it rolls the fabric over, but then you stitch it and it's flat, and then you press it and it's even flatter. And they do make the rolled hem feet in different widths, so they make them really, really, really tiny and then slightly wider, so that they don't make them super big, but
yeah. And of course, we have a video on the website. Beth Bradley, I believe, is the one who shows how to use that rolled hem foot to do a nice narrow hem. All right, we have another question here. We're about out of time, but Tammy wants to know what the best way to store your fabric in plastic tubs to help prevent sun fading and permanent creasing.
That is a really good question. So my tub is actually, it's gray, so no sunlight will get in. You know, it's not a clear tub. But then, you know, I store my fabric in the closet anyway, so it's away from sunlight. As far as preventing permanent creasing, you can roll your fabric if you're worried about creasing. So just, you know, fold it once or twice and then roll it up. And make sure you are not stacking things on top of your fabric, so you don't want to put a lot of weight on them. That'll, you know, squish it down, which is another reason to stack your fabric like in a little filing cabinet, so that it doesn't have, you know, all that weight compressing down on it. They're kind of stacked on their side, so that would prevent permanent creasing, I feel like.
Absolutely. And I guess I've just never had fabric long enough that it would get permanently creased. Like, it comes in and then it goes out and it gets made into something. But
yeah.
So I want to thank you for being here to answer all of the sewing questions and for sharing our mystery project with us using those suggestions from Facebook. I do want to point out, everybody, that there is a sewing challenge that's starting soon. It actually starts Thursday the 24th. It is the Oh So Cute Sewing Challenge. So if you haven't signed up for that, definitely want to do so. I believe there's a banner on the page around this video that you can click on and sign up for it, or sign up on National Sewing Circle's website or on the Facebook page. So we definitely want to see you participate in the challenge and make all sorts of fun projects. But that aside, thank you again for answering all of our questions. You'll be back again next month, and we might be making some changes to our mystery project / theme of the month. So stay tuned to the Facebook page to see what changes we make there. Absolutely. All right.